Hi everyone, welcome back to the Ninth House Notebook. I'm Tom King and this is an astrology podcast where I share what I've been learning about this week. So I've been thinking a lot about Cancer as a sign because we've just entered Cancer season, we've had the summer solstice in the Northern Hemisphere, and I think Cancer has always been a sign that I have misunderstood or I've kind of struggled to wrap my head around a bit. I think partly because when you associate the signs with the seasons, I always found it weird that you have this kind of watery, a sign that's often associated with like vulnerability and retreating to home anyway. This kind of I guess that crab-like. It's the sign of the Cancer is associated with the symbol of the crab. And I always thought that was weird that was at the height of summer. And I suppose that's part of why the season symbology doesn't always fit, because on the other, in the southern hemisphere, it would be, the other way around. It would be the middle of winter, which to me would probably make more sense. So I have been learning a lot about the sign this week, and I wanted to share some of my thoughts and reflections with you on this sign. So I think the main thing to mention is that Cancer is ruled by the moon. And now I did an episode a few weeks ago about the moon in particular and why it symbolizes what it does. But whenever you're looking at a sign of the zodiac, it's really good to look at the ruling planet because that can give you a lot of information about what it represents. So the moon represents things like nurturing, reflectiveness, receptivity, mothers as well, all those kind of symbols. And if you're interested in learning more about the moon, my episode Dancing in the Moonlight, I kind of cover that a little bit more. So I won't be going into depth here about the moon, but those are some of the symbols that come up for the moon, and so they are then associated with Cancer as well because it's ruled by the moon. But the main thing I wanted to talk about today was that you can also look to the element that a sign is associated with. So you've got earth, air, fire, and water, and Cancer is a water sign, and that's helpful because when you think about water, water is often associated symbolically with, again, similar themes to the moon, I suppose, emotions, memory, kind of fluidity, changeability, depth as well. So when you just think about water as an element, that can bring up lots of symbols and symbologies. But specifically, when you look at any of the signs, there's also the quadruplicity, which it's always one of three, and they kind of go in this order round the wheel. So you get cardinal, fixed, and mutable, and then it keeps going around: cardinal, fixed, mutable, cardinal, fixed, mutable. And what that means is that you end up having, for each element, you will always have, a fire sign that is cardinal, which is Aries, a fire sign which is fixed, which is Leo, and wait, what did I just say? I feel like I said that wrong then. A cardinal fire sign, which is Aries, a fixed fire sign, which is Leo, and a mutable fire sign, which would be Sagittarius. I think is a really interesting way of how it goes round the wheel, and it means that all of the elements end up having their own quadruplicity. And I feel like there is another word for quadruplicity that's less complex, but I can't remember what it is right now. I've already recorded the start of this video multiple times because my head is not quite in gear today. So yeah, if you look it up, there'll be another term for it as well. So to speak about those three, cardinal often represents the beginning of something. It's a kind of initiating energy, while fixed signs are more stable. They like to kind of keep things in place. There is that fixed nature to it where it's kind of like, it's solid. It's immovable sometimes. Then you've got mutable signs, where mutable is changeable. It's one thing and then it's the next. I remember hearing someone describe it as like it's cardinal and fixed almost. It kind of embodies both of the energies of the previous two, but in a way that it kind of is able to sort of kind of quickly change from one to the other. So with Cancer, it's a water sign, but it's a cardinal water sign. And that's what we're going to explore today, because for me, that has brought up so much imagery and symbolism that just by exploring that and kind of meditating on it this week, I feel like I've been able to understand the sign a little bit better because of it. So cardinal water, so it's the initiation of this water energy. It's the beginning, the start. And so I started to think about, well, where does water begin, or what elements of water are associated with beginnings? Well, firstly, and this is linked with the moon as well, you think of the waters of the womb. It's the life-giving water, the sort of the fluid, the kind of the sort of brings about life. So that's one thing to mention, and that is often why I think Cancer is associated with the mother and home and family, amongst lots of other reasons that we're going to get into as well. But the other thing was, I was thinking a lot about kind of springs, and a few years ago I went to a place called Bath in the UK, which is built upon, I think it's the only hot springs in the UK, because there's lots of kind of springs, like mountain springs, which have been said to have healing properties, but I think Bath is like the only one that is like hot springs, and there's like Roman baths built there. I feel like that's part of the reason why it's actually called Bath as well, though I might be wrong on that one. And the interesting thing about visiting that place was that, people would come from all over the country to visit this place and to kind of be in the water. And I think that's a really interesting symbol. It's almost like there's this source of kind of, the water is almost pure. It's fresh. It's unadulterated. It's as fresh as it could be in some respects. And that's kind of the same as, if you think about following a river back to its source, it would be high up, high in the hills, high in the mountains. And there's something quite pure about it to some extent. But also at the same time, I suppose, if you think of a well as well, I think that's another thing that comes to mind. It's a point that people will go to. They'll keep returning to it in order to, again, it's that life-giving, you need that water, you need it to live on a day-to-day basis. But for example, if the spring or the well were to become polluted in any way, that would obviously have massive kind of ramifications sort of further down the line. And I think that's something to bear in mind, because it's very easy, I suppose, for me to sit here and say, oh, Cancer, it's pure, and it's kind of this, I suppose I just use the word like unadulterated, but that's not always the case. There is this theme of like the source, just the source as a theme, but it doesn't mean that that's always a really positive thing. I suppose sometimes it could be the source of something very difficult, or the source being, like I said, if it, to use the analogy of a well or a spring, if there was something wrong with the well or the spring, then that would have kind kind of ramifications sort of down the line. One other thing I wanted to mention as well was that there's the Thema Mundi, which is an ancient kind of birth chart for the world in a way, or the universe, sorry, not just the world, the whole universe. And I wanted to mention it briefly because the Cancer is seen as the rising sign of the universe. And this explained, when I found this out, it explained a lot, because I'd often seen kind of, I guess, like tapestries or depictions of the kind of the wheel, the astrological wheel, and Cancer would often be on the left hand side, which I always thought was weird because it meant that Aries was at the top, and the way I'd learned it was always that Aries was on the left hand side, and then that's like where you begin and then you go round. But part of the reason why there is that depiction is because of the Thema Mundi, which it's stating Cancer as almost like the birthplace of the universe, which is interesting as well, considering that the moon is associated with the material realm, almost kind of like the manifestation of something that's kind of beyond the material realm, then coming into fruition. So I thought, again, really interesting that there's also that theme in the Thema Mundi of Cancer being kind of like the birthplace, the source of the universe. So that's some of my reflections on the idea of cardinal water, but I think I then started to kind of put things together in terms of thinking of, okay, well, you have the source, you have this, if Cancer is associated with the place where these things come from, be that, coming from the womb, coming from, a spring, or, the beginning of a river, or whatever it might be. I was thinking, okay, well, how does that link to, Cancer seasons, when it's Cancer season and the sun is going through Cancer, or I suppose just to us on an individual basis, when we have Cancer in our birth charts, what does that symbolize? And I started to think more about like, okay, well, you've got the source, and I feel like Cancer is about returning to the source. And to use the crab as an analogy, I thought it was really interesting that a lot of crabs will migrate back to the place where they were born, on a beach, or in a cave. They kind of make these, huge migrations where they go far inland, and this cycle of migration is linked to the lunar cycle as well. So there's the theme of the moon again, and it returns back to the place where it was born to then lay its eggs and then return back to the sea, and then eventually the baby, which if then makes it out to the sea, will then return to that spot again. So there's this sense of returning back to your own source, where you came from. And another thing to mention is that there's the interplay between light and dark as well. So not just on this, I suppose this applies to the northern hemisphere, but not so much the southern hemisphere, but even just from a philosophical perspective. Throughout the year leading up to the summer solstice, light is increasing, and the darkness is decreasing. Right now where I live, it's the light takes up the majority of the day, and the night is much of a smaller segment. But now that we have gone past the solstice, the daytime is slowly reducing. And so I think you've had this period of 6 months where it's kind of increasing. And I spoke about in my Gemini episode about how Gemini kind of represents this turning point where suddenly it's starting to shift. Well, Cancer is now that shift has happened, and it's now returning back to this more yin reflective darkness. And that's not necessarily darkness as in like a bad way, but just in a more kind of, like I said, it's a kind of a yin reflective sort of space. And I should mention as well with the polarities, so every sign is always either yin or yang, yang being more kind of masculine, expressive energy, like the sun, and yin being more reflective, internal, kind of receptive energy, like the moon. And Cancer is a yin sign, which makes a lot of sense with it being ruled by the moon. So there's the crab to consider, which I was, the more I looked into that earlier, I was like just fascinated by it. And then there's the idea of like returning to darkness from this kind of like, from light being the kind of reigning power and then returning back. But also I wanted to talk about Cancer can be associated with vulnerability, and there's a sense of like safety and security, which again links with the idea of the image of the crab. It's got its home on its back, and it's kind of like it can retreat into that space to protect itself. But again, I'd often wonder, why is it that Cancer is associated with those things, that kind of sense of safety and security? But again, it makes sense if you think about it. It's about returning to something, returning to the source. And it made me think a lot about attachment theory. So I'm going to be I've been going back and thinking about some early psychology knowledge that I learned when I was doing psychology in A-levels and at university as well, which is, so there were a couple of things. So back in I think it was like the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of interest in attachment theory. It was like, well, I think before that there was kind of an assumption that children, babies in particular, they just need to be fed. That's it. They just need to be fed and they need to be kept alive, and that's it. It doesn't really matter whether they're away from their parents. There was a lot of studies into in hospitals, because children would end up spending time overnight there, and what they began to notice was that actually it was quite detrimental for young children, and especially babies, to be away from their parents for kind of long period of time, or to not have some form of caregiver. This was then kind of repeated in there was a psychologist called Harlow who did a famous study called Harlow's monkeys, which, by the way, totally unethical, but he basically got these monkeys in a cage, and there was two fake mothers. One was like a wire, I think they were both like wire kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of false mothers in a way. And one of them just had food, and the other one was covered in kind of like wool, and it was very like comfortable and a comforting kind of mother. And they assumed that because of the food, that then it wouldn't really be bothered about the other one, because the other one didn't have any food, and it would just go for the food. But what they actually found was that although it did occasionally go to eat the food, it would spend all of its time with the comfortable, kind of the wool, soft mother in a way. There was another experiment as well. I mean, there's a lot, but the other one I wanted to mention that I thought was particularly relevant was The Strange Situation. I think it was by Ainsworth. I'm showing my memory now of my early psychology knowledge, but there was an experiment where they observed children with their parents in lots of different situations, and this is where attachment theory comes from. So when you hear people talk about like anxious attachment or avoidant attachment or whatever it might be, this is the experiment that came up with those terms. And the way that they did it was that they through a sort of one-sided mirror, one-sided mirror. They had like the children that would be like playing, and then doing lots of different things, and then they would have a stranger enter the room, and they would see how the children would react. And what they often found was that children, when faced with an uncertain situation, would return to their mothers or their caregiver, and they'd return for comfort and support. And the reason I bring this up is because, to me, it almost represents that idea of like, a term that was used in that study is the idea of a safe base. And I think cancer is all about that. It's all about that safe base. What is your safe base? Where do you return to feel safe and feel like you know that you're kind of going to be okay in that period of vulnerability? I think it's interesting as well that Cancer follows on from Gemini, and I spoke a couple of weeks ago about how Gemini is quite playful, it's trying out lots of things, it's experimenting, and in the same way with these children, often they would go out into the room and they would explore. But then as soon as, and not always even when, a stranger would come in, but sometimes they would just get to a point where they're like, okay, I've explored enough now, I need to return, and I need to be like checking in. And if you've ever seen children play, or maybe you have children yourself, you might notice that they, especially when they're younger, they do that. They'll go off and they'll do something, and then they'll come back because there's like almost like a checking in, like, oh, are we okay? Is everything okay? All right, okay, yeah, and then they go off, and then they return to their sort of playing again. So that made a lot of sense to me when I thought about it like that. The link between our attachments, the places that we go to when we're feeling vulnerable, and that kind of idea of like, what's your safe base and how do you return to that? Where do you go when you're feeling vulnerable? Because I think Cancer is all about that comforting, reassuring energy. Another thing as well is that Cancer is often associated with the home and with family. And I think for a similar reason, it's the place where we came from. And so it's that source, the source of the river, the source of this emotion. And again, that can sometimes be a good thing or a bad thing. But there's definitely something about not only our physical home, even the one that we live in now, every day we go out and we do things and we come back and we sleep here. It's like our home is our safe base. But also when we're thinking about back in time, the memory of our homes, the memories of our families, the memories of what our safe base was when we were younger, is all wrapped up in Cancer. And I wanted to share a story because reflecting on this reminded me of a few years ago. I was having therapy, and therapy itself is quite a Cancerian process in a way, because it by exploring these memories, where I came from, the source of who I am, it makes us feel very vulnerable, and it makes us feel like it's almost that kind of those questions of who am I? How did I get here? Why am I the way that I am? And when I was going through that process, I found myself really wanting to reconnect with my past. And I had an amazing opportunity to sort of go back to my childhood home. So this was a house that I'd lived in from being 5 years old to about 13 years old. So pretty much most of my childhood memories were there. And I'd remembered that I had put a 5-year-old handprint in the when they were doing the driveway, the putting the concrete in. And I thought, I wonder if it's still there. So I went back and I revisited it. And there it was, my 5-year-old handprint. And interestingly, right next to it was my mum's, who, her handprint was now smaller than mine. And the interesting thing was that the person who lived at the place that was my home came out and actually looked quite kind of like, who the hell are you? And I explained, oh, I used to live here. And they said, oh, do you know? And then they said the names of the neighbours that lived next door. Because they said, oh, they've lived here forever. And I recognised the names. They were the same neighbours that I'd had when I had lived there as a child. And so I went round and I knocked on the door, and they invited me in. And it was such an intense experience, because they were an older couple. Their house had not changed since I had last been there. And I think at this point it must have been over a decade ago since I had been there. And yeah, it's hard to, maybe you've had an experience like that yourself, but it's hard to overstate the power that returning to somewhere like that you haven't been to for so long, the power that has, because suddenly all of these, not even necessarily specific memories, but just a feeling, it felt like I had returned to the source of something. And it was a really profound experience, not only the handprint, but also being in that space again. I think in a weird way, I actually got more of a powerful experience from visiting my neighbour's house, because I hadn't changed. Whereas if I'd gone, if the person who lived in my old house had said, oh yeah, sure, do you want to come in and have a look around? Which I suppose would have been kind of weird. Like it didn't look, they'd knocked it all through, and it would have looked completely different, which might have been more of an alienating experience. But being in my neighbour's house, it was like, God, I feel like I'm 10 again. This is so strange. And they were telling me lots of things. They were reflecting as well, and saying about memories they had of me and my family. So I mention that because I feel like that's a really good thing to do this cancer season. Not necessarily visit your old childhood home, but I think reminiscing and thinking about, where did I come from? How did I get here? Because I suppose for me personally, I realised that the last few years I've been very much focused on the future. I've definitely had I'm in general, I'm probably much more of a kind of thinking about the past, and I have my Mercury in Cancer, so I do like to think about, memories and the past, and how that past makes us who we are now. But these last couple of years, because of how things have been going with my career, I've been thinking a lot more about the future. And it's been so nice this week to embrace reminiscing and embrace that, going back to memories that I haven't thought about for a while. And there's a few ways that you can do that. I've actually been doing that with, so because it's the Venus in Leo retrograde coming up next month, I have been thinking a lot back to 2015, which was the last time that Venus in Leo was in retrograde, or Venus was in retrograde in Leo, because it happens every 8 years that it returns to the same sign. And I have been listening to loads of music that I had listened to back in 2015, and it's just been a joy. I've been really enjoying it and rediscovering it. And I think sometimes as well, there's something about music or films, or maybe even like books that you may have read at the time. I mean, I don't actually have any journal entries from that time, so I can't necessarily kind of go back and read those things. But even just listening to music, I feel like that is a very water experience. You know, if you think again of thinking about water as an element, it's that it's not as concrete as earth. You know, it's not as kind of cognitive as air. It's a feeling that you get. And sometimes I found listening to these music, listening to this music, to these songs, and in the same way as when I returned to that house, it wasn't anything concrete that I could remember, but it was a feeling. And it was a feeling that I knew I'd felt before. And so I think this Cancer season, you know, if you're able to, you know, I mean, you may be the kind of person that reminisces all the time and maybe you're sick of it and you want to do something else, but I feel like Cancer season is the perfect time to sort of think back, but not only think back, but feel back, returning to the feelings. And that might be going back to a place that you used to visit a lot, you know, whether that was when you were a child or even just a few years ago that you've not been to in a while. It could be listening to songs that you haven't listened to in a while, or watching a film that you haven't watched, meeting up with a person that you haven't spoken to in a long time. Because that's, as I'm learning about it, that's what I think Cancer's all about. You know, it's returning and reminiscing. So the other thing actually as well, I'm glad I wrote some notes today. The other thing to mention as well is like, I've been thinking a lot about inspiration as well. And I think I've spoken to quite a few people this week who've talked about losing the inspiration for something, you know, like say they, you know, play piano and they're like, I just don't really want to, you know, I'm not really feeling it at the moment. Or maybe it's like, you know, you're an artist and you've kind of been struggling to sort of think. It could be anything. It could even just be like an area that you're interested in, learning about, but then you've not really been learning. It could be that reading books, for example, you know, you love reading books, but recently you've not been able to engage with that as much. I feel like Cancer season, again, if we're talking about reminiscing and returning, it's almost like returning to what made you interested and inspired by that in the first place. Because I've noticed that as a theme this week as well, of people saying like, oh, I really want to return to this thing, but I've just not been feeling it recently. Well, what made you want to do that in the first place? And I've been doing that for myself in terms of music and writing songs. I've been like going back and listening to songs that I wrote a long time ago and thinking about what inspired me then. So that's a few of my reflections. I'd love to hear what you think about Cancer as a sign. Maybe you have some planets in Cancer and you can resonate with some of what I've spoken about today. But also let me know, have you been reminiscing as we've entered Cancer season? Have you found yourself looking back and returning to the source of things? And if so, how have you been going about that? I'd love to hear it. But thanks again for listening, and I will see you all again next week.